Mr. Henry Collins was a man who defied expectations. Despite being an elderly millionaire, his lifestyle was anything but extravagant. Henry was a man of simple pleasures, and by looking at him, no one would ever guess his immense wealth. He lived in a modest, cozy house in a suburban neighborhood, far from the bustling city. His neighbors knew him as the kind older gentleman who often tended to his garden and greeted them warmly with a smile. His clothes were always plain, simple shirts, worn-out trousers, and comfortable shoes that had long lost their shine. To Henry, material wealth was never a marker of someone's true value. Instead, he believed that family, kindness, and the impact one made on others' lives were what truly mattered. Henry's fortune came from a lottery win many years ago, but unlike others who might have squandered such winnings on luxury and indulgence, Henry had been careful. He invested most of the money, saved wisely, and chose to continue living as though his bank account had barely changed. It wasn't that Henry disliked the idea of enjoying life. He simply found joy in the little things, the smell of freshly baked bread, the warmth of a sunny afternoon, and most of all, spending time with his grandson, Leo. Leo was the light of Henry's life. The 7-year-old boy was full of energy, curiosity, and enthusiasm, and he had an infectious love for cars, especially Ferraris. Every time a Ferrari sped by, Leo's eyes would light up, and he would gaze at it in awe, his small hands mimicking the steering wheel as if he were the one behind the wheel. To him, Ferraris weren't just cars. They represented adventure, speed, and above all, freedom. Leo often spoke of his dream of riding in one, imagining himself zooming down a winding road with the wind in his hair. Henry would listen to these dreams with a smile, enjoying the sparkle in his grandson's eyes. But recently, that sparkle had started to fade. Leo had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a cruel and relentless disease that gradually took away his strength. It was heartbreaking for Henry to see his once lively grandson becoming weaker, losing the energy that had once defined him. Leo still talked about Ferraris, but his voice had grown softer, his dreams seeming more like wistful fantasies than the confident plans they used to be. Henry could see that the disease was stealing away not just Leo's health, but also his spirit. He knew he had to do something, anything, to bring back that light in Leo's eyes, even if only for a moment. One afternoon, as Henry sat beside Leo's bed, watching his grandson's tired eyes struggle to stay open, he made up his mind. He decided that he would make Leo's dream come true. He wasn't just buying a car, he was buying a moment of pure joy for his grandson, a memory that would be more precious than anything money could buy. Henry knew this would be a significant decision, one that went beyond material value. It was about hope, love, and giving Leo something to hold on to, a moment of freedom that his frail body could no longer provide him. Henry had never set foot in a luxury car dealership before. In fact, he had never even considered buying a luxury car for himself. To him, cars were simply a means of transportation, and his old sedan served him perfectly well. But this wasn't about practicality, it was about a dream. And for that, Henry was willing to step out of his comfort zone. He put on his best shirt, which, despite being his finest, was still simple and bore the marks of time. He combed his thinning hair, took a deep breath, and set out for the Ferrari dealership. As Henry approached the dealership, its imposing facade of glass and steel gleamed in the sunlight. The large red Ferrari logo seemed to stare down at him, almost challenging him to enter. Henry hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place. He knew he didn't look like the typical customer who walked through those doors. His clothes were too plain, his demeanor too humble. But then he thought of Leo, of the joy that would fill his grandson's heart, and he found the courage to push open the door and step inside. The showroom was a dazzling display of wealth and luxury. Bright lights reflected off the polished surfaces of the cars, each one a masterpiece of engineering and design. Henry walked slowly, his eyes scanning the rows of Ferraris, their vibrant colors and sleek lines mesmerizing. He felt a mix of awe and determination. He wasn't here for himself, he was here for Leo. And that thought gave him strength. Henry approached one of the cars, a bright red Ferrari, the kind Leo always talked about. He could already imagine Leo's face lighting up, the boys' laughter filling the air as they drove down an open road. Henry reached out, his hand hovering over the smooth surface of the car, when a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Can I help you, sir?" The voice was polite, but carried an undertone that made Henry feel immediately self-conscious. He turned to see a well-dressed man, his eyes quickly assessing Henry's worn-out clothes and hesitant posture. Henry cleared his throat and nodded. Yes, I'd like to buy a Ferrari. The salesman raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on his lips. A Ferrari, sir? These cars are quite expensive. Are you sure this is what you're looking for? Henry felt a pang of discomfort but stood his ground. I'm sure, he said firmly. I want to buy one for my grandson. The salesman hesitated, his skeptical gaze lingering on Henry. But Henry didn't waver. He wasn't here to be judged. He was here for Leo. And nothing, not even the condescending attitude of a salesman, would stop him from fulfilling his promise to his grandson. When Henry walked into the dealership, the bright lights reflecting off the luxurious cars filled his view, making him feel slightly overwhelmed. The glossy floors and gleaming cars created an atmosphere of exclusivity, almost as if the showroom was designed to intimidate those who didn't fit a certain image. Despite the intimidating aura, Henry moved forward, his eyes scanning the various cars until they landed on a bright red Ferrari. It was just like the one Leo always dreamed of, vibrant, powerful, and full of promise. Henry hesitantly approached it, his hand reaching out to feel the smooth surface of the car, admiring its elegant lines and flawless finish. While Henry was lost in admiration, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Can I help you?" The words were sharp, cutting through the moment. Henry turned and found himself face to face with a man in a perfectly tailored suit. His name tag read Mark. Mark was the dealership manager, and he was someone who prided himself on reading people at a glance. To Mark, appearances meant everything, and one glance at Henry's worn-out clothes was enough for him to make up his mind. Mark's eyes swept over Henry, taking in the old shirt, the faded pants, and the scuffed shoes. He made no attempt to hide his disdain. To him, Henry looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. The luxurious dealership was not meant for people like him, at least, that was Mark's assumption. "Can I help you?" Mark repeated, this time with a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His tone was cold, lacking any of the warmth one might expect from someone in customer service. Henry, however, remained calm. He was here for Leo, and nothing else mattered. "Yes," Henry replied, his voice steady. "I want to buy a Ferrari for my grandson." Mark's smirk widened into a full-blown smile, one that carried no kindness. He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "A Ferrari," he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "A Ferrari isn't the kind of car for just anyone, old man. Maybe you should look for something more suitable elsewhere, something that fits your budget," he added, the sarcasm evident. Henry felt a pang of disappointment, but he wasn't ready to give up. He had come here with a purpose, and he wasn't about to let someone's prejudice deter him. "I can afford this car," Henry said firmly, looking Mark directly in the eyes. "I just want to fulfill my grandson's dream." Mark's smile faded slightly, but his skepticism remained. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture oozing arrogance. "Look, sir," he said, his tone condescending, "these cars are not cheap. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars here. I think you might be better off looking at something more realistic." Henry's heart sank a little, but he stood his ground. "I know how much it costs," he said, "and I am prepared to pay for it." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. He glanced around the showroom, as if hoping to spot someone who could confirm that this was all some kind of joke. When no such person appeared, he let out an exasperated sigh. "Sir, I think you'd better leave before I have to call security," he said, his patience clearly wearing thin. His voice was now filled with annoyance, as though Henry's very presence was an inconvenience. Henry felt a mix of emotions, disappointment, frustration, and a deep sadness. He wasn't used to being treated this way, especially when all he wanted was to bring joy to his grandson. But he also understood that people like Mark saw only the surface. They judged based on appearances, never bothering to look deeper. Henry took a deep breath, his hand still resting on the Ferrari. He could picture Leo's face, the way his eyes would light up at the sight of the car. That image gave him strength. "I understand," Henry said quietly, his voice steady despite the hurt. "But I assure you, I am serious about buying this car. My grandson has always dreamed of riding in a Ferrari, and I want to make that dream come true." Mark rolled his eyes, clearly growing tired of the conversation. "I'm sorry, but I can't waste my time on fantasies," he said bluntly. He gestured towards the exit, his meaning clear. If you can't prove you have the means, then I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had expected some difficulty, but he hadn't anticipated outright hostility. He gave the car one last look, a pang of longing in his heart, before turning away. As he began to walk towards the exit, his steps slow and heavy, he heard a voice call out, "Wait." Henry paused, turning around to see a young man hurrying towards him. The young man wore a crisp shirt and had a friendly, approachable demeanor. His name tag read Jack. Unlike Mark, Jack's eyes held no judgment, only curiosity and something that looked like empathy. "Sir, I'm really sorry about that," Jack said, casting a glance towards Mark, who was now watching from a distance with a frown. "Please, come back. I'd be more than happy to help you." Jack's voice was sincere, and there was a warmth to it that immediately put Henry at ease. Henry hesitated for a moment. He had already faced so much rejection, and part of him just wanted to leave. But then he thought of Leo again, of the boy's laughter and the way his face would light up. He couldn't give up, not yet. "All right," Henry said, nodding. He followed Jack back into the showroom, his heart lifting slightly. Jack led him towards a seating area and offered him a chair. "Let me get you some water," Jack said before disappearing for a moment. Henry took a seat, glancing around the showroom. He could still see Mark in the distance, glaring at them, but he chose to ignore it. He wasn't here for Mark. He was here for Leo. When Jack returned, he handed Henry a glass of water and sat down across from him. "Now, let's start over," Jack said, smiling. "You mentioned you wanted to buy a Ferrari for your grandson?" Henry nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "Yes," he said. "My grandson, Leo, he's been dreaming about this for a long time. He's not well," Henry added, his voice catching slightly. "And I want to do something special for him." Jack's expression softened, and he leaned forward, listening intently. "I understand," he said. "Let's see what we can do." Jack stood up, motioning for Henry to follow him. Together, they walked back towards the row of Ferraris, the bright colors shining under the showroom lights. As they approached the car Henry had first admired, Jack began explaining the features, his voice filled with enthusiasm. Unlike Mark, Jack seemed genuinely interested in helping Henry, and for the first time since he walked into the dealership, Henry felt hopeful. Jack's kindness was a stark contrast to Mark's arrogance, and it reminded Henry that there were still good people in the world, people who looked beyond appearances and cared about others. As Jack spoke, Henry found himself smiling, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. Maybe, just maybe, he would be able to make Leo's dream come true after all. As Henry turned to leave, sadness and disappointment weighed heavily on his heart. He had come here with hope, a determination to fulfill his grandson Leo's dream, but it seemed that prejudice and arrogance had shattered his plans. He thought of Leo's smile, the light in his eyes whenever he talked about Ferraris, and it pained him to think that he might not be able to bring that joy to his beloved grandson. Henry's steps were slow, his head bowed, and it seemed like the bright showroom was closing in on him. But then, just as Henry was about to push open the glass door and leave, a voice called out, clear and sincere, "Sir, please wait." Henry stopped and turned around, surprised. He saw a young man hurrying towards him. The young man, whose name tag read Jack, had a kind expression and an earnest look in his eyes. Jack was different from the other staff members Henry had encountered. His demeanor was approachable, and he had a genuine warmth that immediately put Henry at ease. "Sir, I'm very sorry for Mark's attitude," Jack said, slightly out of breath. "Please, come back. I would love to help you in any way I can." Henry hesitated. He had already faced so much rejection, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to stay. But there was something about Jack's sincerity that made him pause. It wasn't just the words Jack spoke, it was the way he spoke them, with genuine care and empathy. Henry nodded slowly, feeling a small glimmer of hope, and followed Jack back into the dealership. Jack led Henry to a more comfortable seating area, offering him a seat. "Can I get you some water or anything else?" Jack asked politely. Henry shook his head, a faint smile appearing on his face. It had been a while since someone had treated him with such respect. "Thank you," Henry said quietly. He could see Jack's genuine concern, and it helped ease the sting of his earlier experience. Jack took a seat across from Henry and listened attentively as Henry began to share his story. Henry talked about Leo, about the boy's fascination with Ferraris, how his eyes would light up every time he saw one. He spoke of Leo's illness, how the multiple sclerosis was taking away his strength, how his once energetic grandson now spent his days fighting a battle no child should have to face. As Henry spoke, Jack listened, his expression softening. He could feel the love Henry had for his grandson, the depth of his desire to bring even a moment of happiness to Leo's life. Jack was moved by the story, by Henry's determination, and by the pure, selfless love that motivated him to walk into a place where he felt he didn't belong, just to fulfill his grandson's dream. "Mr. Collins," Jack said after a moment, his voice gentle, "I think your story needs to be heard by someone else as well." Henry looked at Jack, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "My mother, Laura, owns this dealership. She always believes in doing the right thing and taking care of our customers. I think she would want to hear your story." Jack took out his phone and dialed his mother's number. "Mom, I need you to come to the dealership," Jack said once Laura answered. "There's something very special you need to hear." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Laura spoke. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she said, her voice filled with concern. Jack turned back to Henry, giving him an encouraging smile. "She'll be here soon, Mr. Collins. In the meantime, why don't we take a look at some of the cars? I know Leo would love for you to pick the perfect one." Henry felt a lump form in his throat. He was overwhelmed by Jack's kindness, by the young man's willingness to help, even when it wasn't his responsibility. It reminded Henry that there were still good people in the world, people who looked beyond appearances and genuinely cared for others. Jack led Henry through the showroom, stopping at each Ferrari, pointing out the features that Leo would love. They walked by bright red models, sleek black ones, and even a shimmering blue Ferrari that Jack thought Leo might find fascinating. As they moved from car to car, Jack explained the details, the horsepower, the acceleration, the feeling of driving one of these magnificent machines. Henry listened, his mind picturing Leo's excitement, the way his grandson's eyes would widen at the sight of these incredible cars. As they walked, Jack shared stories of his own, how his father had been a car enthusiast and had passed that love on to him. Jack spoke of how cars represented more than just a means of transportation. To many people, they represented dreams, freedom, and possibilities. Henry found himself smiling, feeling an unexpected connection with the young man. Jack wasn't just a salesman. He was someone who understood what it meant to dream, and he was determined to help Henry make Leo's dream a reality. Time passed quickly as they admired the cars, and soon enough, Henry heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see a woman walking towards them. She was elegant, with an air of warmth and confidence. Her eyes were kind, and when she saw Henry, she smiled. "Mr. Collins, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Laura, Jack's mother." Henry shook her hand, feeling the sincerity in her grip. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice slightly shaky. Laura nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Jack told me a bit about your grandson, Leo," she said. "I'd love to hear more." They returned to the seating area, and Henry once again shared Leo's story, his love for Ferraris, his battle with his illness, and his dream of one day riding in a car that represented everything he admired. Laura listened intently, her expression softening as she heard Henry's words. She could see the love and determination in his eyes, and it touched her deeply. When Henry finished, Laura took a deep breath, her heart heavy with empathy. "Mr. Collins," she said gently, "your grandson sounds like an incredible boy, and I can see how much this means to you. Here at our dealership, we believe in making dreams come true, not just selling cars." She glanced at Jack, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I want to help you make Leo's dream a reality," Laura continued. "We will do everything we can to ensure that your grandson gets to experience the joy of riding in a Ferrari." Henry felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had walked into the dealership that day with nothing but hope, and now it seemed like that hope was being rewarded. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me and to Leo." Laura smiled warmly. "It's our pleasure, Mr. Collins. We'll make sure Leo gets the experience he deserves." She stood up, extending her hand once more. "Jack and I will take care of everything. You just focus on bringing that smile to your grandson's face." Henry shook her hand, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time since Leo's diagnosis, he felt like things were going to be okay, that there was still hope, and that he could still give Leo a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. As Laura and Jack began discussing the details, Henry allowed himself to relax, the burden on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. It wasn't just about buying a car anymore. It was about the kindness of strangers, about people coming together to make a child's dream come true. And for Henry, that meant more than anything in the world. Laura arrived at the dealership, her elegant presence commanding attention as she stepped through the glass doors. Jack waved her over, and she approached the seating area where Henry sat. She extended her hand, and Henry stood to greet her. Her handshake was warm, and her eyes were filled with empathy as she introduced herself. "Mr. Collins, I'm Laura. Jack has told me a bit about you, and I'd love to hear your story," she said, her voice gentle yet sincere. Henry nodded, and they both took their seats, Jack standing nearby, eager to support his mother and Henry. Henry began to speak, his voice trembling slightly as he shared Leo's story. He described Leo's fascination with Ferraris, how his grandson's eyes would light up whenever he talked about them, and how his illness had slowly begun to sap the life out of him. Laura listened attentively, her gaze never leaving Henry's face, her heart breaking as she imagined what Henry and Leo were going through. She could feel the love Henry had for his grandson in every word he spoke, the desperation in his voice, and the hope that kept him going. "Leo has always dreamed of riding in a Ferrari," Henry said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's all he talks about, and I just want to make that dream come true for him, to see him smile again. That's why I came here today. I want to give him that moment of happiness." Laura felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. She reached out, placing her hand gently on Henry's. "Mr. Collins," she began, her voice soft but firm, "your story has touched my heart deeply. I want to help you and Leo in any way I can. In fact, I want to give you and Leo this Ferrari as a gift from us. It's not just about the car, it's about making a young boy's dream come true." Henry looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected this kind of generosity from someone he'd only just met. He felt his heart swell with gratitude, but he also felt a sense of pride. He shook his head slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Laura. I can't express how much this means to me, but I have to insist on paying for it. I want to keep the fairness and the value of this gift for my grandson. It's important to me that Leo knows this wasn't just given to him, that it's something we earned." Laura smiled, a warm and understanding smile that reached her eyes. She respected Henry's integrity, the pride he took in wanting to pay for the car, and she understood what it meant for him. "I understand, Mr. Collins," she said. "We'll make sure everything is done the way you want. Let's get started on the paperwork." Jack nodded and led them to a desk where they could finalize the details. He handed Henry the paperwork, explaining each step as they went along. Henry listened carefully, signing where needed, his heart pounding with anticipation. He could already picture Leo's face when he would see the car, and that thought filled him with a sense of purpose and joy. Just as they were finishing up, the sound of footsteps echoed across the showroom floor. Mark, the manager who had earlier dismissed Henry, had returned from his break. He glanced around the dealership, his eyes narrowing when he spotted Henry still inside. His face twisted in irritation as he strode over, clearly displeased. "You're still here," Mark sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I thought I made it clear that this isn't the place for you." He glanced at the paperwork on the desk, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "Are you seriously wasting our time with this?" Before Henry could respond, Laura stood up, her presence commanding and authoritative. "Mark," she said, her voice cold as steel. Mark froze, his face paling as he realized who was standing before him. "I've been standing here listening to you speak to Mr. Collins in the most disrespectful manner imaginable. This is not how we treat our customers. This is not how we treat anyone." Mark stammered, clearly taken aback. "Mrs. Laura, I didn't realize." Laura raised a hand, silencing him. "That's enough, Mark. Your behavior today has been unacceptable. Mr. Collins is here to buy a car, and he deserves to be treated with the utmost respect, just like any other customer." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "I've tried to be patient with you, but this is the final straw. You're fired. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my dealership." Mark's face went white, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. But Laura had already turned her back on him, her attention returning to Henry, who watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Mr. Collins," Laura said, her voice softening. "Please know that Mark's actions do not reflect the values of this dealership. We are here to help you, and we're going to make sure Leo's dream comes true." Henry nodded, his emotions swirling. He hadn't expected any of this when he walked into the dealership that day. The kindness he had found in Jack, and now in Laura, was overwhelming. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Laura smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "We're honored to be part of this journey with you and Leo," she said. "Let's get this car ready for your grandson." With the paperwork completed, Laura and Jack began making the necessary arrangements. Jack excused himself to prepare the car, while Laura stayed with Henry, making small talk to put him at ease. She asked about Leo, and Henry spoke of his grandson with pride, his love for adventure, his fascination with cars, and his strength in the face of his illness. Laura listened, genuinely interested, her heart aching for the struggles that Leo and Henry were facing. Soon, Jack returned, a broad smile on his face. "The car is ready," he announced. "Mr. Collins, would you like to take a look?" Henry's heart raced as he stood, following Jack and Laura across the showroom floor. There, in the center of the bright lights, was the red Ferrari, polished to perfection, its sleek body glistening under the showroom lights. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat as he imagined Leo sitting inside, his face lighting up with joy. "It's beautiful," Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Laura smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "Leo is going to love it," she said. "And we're going to make sure that everything is perfect for him." Henry nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that despite everything, despite the illness and the struggles, there was still joy to be found, still dreams that could come true. "Thank you," Henry said again, his voice filled with gratitude. Laura and Jack both smiled, and for a moment, the showroom was filled with a sense of something greater than just a business transaction. It was filled with kindness, compassion, and the power of a shared dream. Together, they stood before the Ferrari, knowing that soon, Leo would be sitting there, his dream finally realized. And for Henry, that was everything. Mark stood there in stunned silence, his face turning red as Laura's words sank in. He had never imagined that his arrogance would cost him his job. He looked around, noticing the eyes of other employees and customers on him. His pride crumbled, and he felt a deep sense of shame. But just as he was about to leave in humiliation, Henry's calm voice broke through the tension. "Please, Mrs. Laura," Henry said, his voice gentle yet full of conviction. "I believe everyone deserves a chance to change. If Mark is willing, I think he can learn to be better." Henry's eyes met Mark's, and for the first time, Mark saw not just an elderly man but someone with immense strength and compassion. Henry's eyes were kind, and they held no malice, only a desire to see the best in others. Laura paused, looking between Henry and Mark. She could see the sincerity in Henry's plea, and she could also see the raw vulnerability in Mark's expression. She let out a sigh, her stance softening slightly. "All right, Mr. Collins," she said, turning back to Mark. "Mark, if you're willing to prove that you can change, I'll consider giving you another chance. But understand this, your behavior needs to change completely. Respect, kindness, and humility. If you can't demonstrate those values, then there's no place for you here." Mark swallowed hard, his pride giving way to a genuine sense of remorse. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mrs. Laura. And thank you, Mr. Collins. I promise I won't let you down." Henry nodded, a small smile on his face. He believed in redemption, and he hoped that Mark would take this opportunity to become a better person. Laura gestured for Mark to step away, giving her, Jack, and Henry space to finish up the paperwork. As Mark walked away, he glanced back, a look of gratitude in his eyes, and for the first time, he truly understood the impact of Henry's kindness. With the paperwork completed, the moment Henry had been waiting for finally arrived. The keys to the bright red Ferrari were handed to him, and Jack gave him an encouraging nod. "Let's make Leo's dream come true," Jack said, his smile genuine. Henry felt his heart swell with emotion, and with Laura and Jack's help, he carefully drove the Ferrari out of the showroom, its engine purring smoothly. The ride to the hospital was filled with anticipation. Henry's hands gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts focused solely on Leo and the joy he was about to bring to his grandson. As he approached the hospital, he could already see a small group gathered outside. His daughter Alice, a nurse, and of course Leo, who sat in a wheelchair, his eyes wide with wonder as the Ferrari pulled up. The moment Leo saw the car, his entire face lit up, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked at his mother, then back at the Ferrari, as if trying to confirm that what he was seeing was real. "Grandpa, is that really for me?" Leo's voice was filled with awe, his eyes shimmering with excitement. Henry smiled, stepping out of the car and walking over to Leo. He knelt beside his grandson, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "Yes, my boy," he said softly, his voice filled with love. "This is for you. Today, we're going to have that ride you've always dreamed of." With the help of Alice and the nurse, Henry carefully lifted Leo from the wheelchair and placed him into the passenger seat of the Ferrari. Leo's small hands touched the dashboard, his fingers running over the smooth surface as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. He looked at Henry, his smile brighter than it had been in months. "Thank you, Grandpa," Leo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Henry nodded, his own heart full. "Anything for you, Leo," he said, closing the door gently. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the engine. The low, powerful rumble filled the air, and Leo's eyes widened even more, his face lighting up with pure joy. As Henry began to drive, the Ferrari glided smoothly through the streets, the wind rushing past them. Leo's laughter filled the car, a sound so pure and full of life that it brought tears to Henry's eyes. For those precious moments, there was no illness, no hospital, just the open road, the roar of the engine, and the sheer joy of being together. Leo's eyes were wide with wonder as they sped up, the buildings and trees blurring into streaks of color. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind on his face, imagining himself racing down a track, free and unburdened. Henry glanced over at his grandson, his heart swelling with love. This was everything he had hoped for, to give Leo a moment of freedom, of pure, unfiltered happiness. He drove through the streets, taking turns smoothly, making sure the ride was thrilling but safe. They passed by a park, the sun shining brightly, and Leo waved to people they drove by, his laughter infectious. After a while, Henry slowed the car, turning onto a quieter road that led to a scenic overlook. He pulled over, putting the car in park, and looked at Leo. "What do you think, champ?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Leo looked at his grandfather, his eyes shining with tears of joy. "It's amazing, Grandpa. It's everything I dreamed of, and more," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He reached over, hugging Henry as best as he could from the passenger seat. Henry wrapped an arm around Leo, holding him close, the weight of the moment settling in his heart. They sat there for a few minutes, just taking in the view and the warmth of the moment. Henry knew that this ride, this day, would be something Leo would carry with him, a memory that would outshine the pain and the struggle. And for Henry, it was a reminder that love, in its purest form, could overcome anything, even the harshest of realities. When they finally returned to the hospital, Alice was waiting for them, her eyes filled with tears as she watched her son's face, which was glowing with happiness. Henry carefully helped Leo back into his wheelchair, and Leo looked up at his mother, his face still flushed with excitement. "Mom, it was amazing. Grandpa drove so fast, and it felt like I was flying." Alice knelt beside Leo, her heart swelling with gratitude and love for her father. She looked up at Henry, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've given him something no one else could." Henry smiled, his heart full. "He deserves it," he said simply. He looked at Leo, who was still smiling, his eyes bright and full of life. And in that moment, Henry knew that all the challenges, all the hardships, had been worth it, for this one perfect day, for Leo's laughter and his smile. As they wheeled Leo back inside, Mark watched from a distance, his expression thoughtful. He had seen the entire scene, the joy on Leo's face, the love between grandfather and grandson, and he felt something stir within him. He realized just how wrong he had been, how blind he had been to what truly mattered. He vowed, silently, that he would take this second chance seriously, that he would change, not just for himself, but because of the kindness Henry had shown him. And as the Ferrari's engine quieted and the day drew to a close, it was clear that this was more than just a ride. It was a testament to love, to second chances, and to the power of a dream fulfilled. The ride with his grandfather in the Ferrari was the happiest moment of Leo's short life. As they drove through the streets, the wind rushing past, the rumble of the engine beneath them, Leo felt as if he were flying. It was a moment of pure freedom and joy, one that lifted the weight of his illness, if only for a little while. It was a memory that Henry would cherish forever, the sight of his grandson's smile, the sound of his laughter echoing through the car. But as the doctors had warned, Leo's illness was unrelenting. Only a short time after that unforgettable ride, Leo passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family. His death left a deep void, a silence that seemed impossible to fill. Yet, in the midst of grief, there was also gratitude. Gratitude for the moments they had shared, for the chance to make Leo's dream come true, and for the memory of his bright smile. For Henry, Alice, and everyone who had come to know Leo's story, that ride had become a symbol of love, hope, and the importance of making every moment count. The impact of Leo's story went beyond his family. It had touched the hearts of those at the dealership, too. Jack, who had been instrumental in making that day happen, often thought of Leo and the happiness that they had been able to bring him. Laura, too, found herself reflecting on Leo's story, and she felt a deep need to ensure that Leo's legacy would live on. One evening, as Laura and Jack were closing up the dealership, Laura turned to her son, her expression thoughtful. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but full of conviction, "I don't think Leo's story should end here. He taught us something so important, that the most valuable thing we can offer is love and compassion. We need to remember that every day. I want to rename the dealership in his honor. Leo Collins Dealership. What do you think?" Jack looked at his mother, his eyes filled with emotion. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Mom," he said. "Leo's story deserves to be shared, and if we can use our dealership to inspire people, then that's exactly what we should do." And so, the decision was made. The dealership was renamed Leo Collins Dealership, and with the new name came a new spirit. Laura and Jack wanted everyone who walked through their doors to know about Leo, to know about his dream, his courage, and the love his grandfather had shown him. They believed that sharing Leo's story would help others understand the true value of life, beyond material wealth and luxury cars. The grand reopening of the dealership was a special event. Laura invited Henry and Alice, and they were honored to attend. The new sign was unveiled, bearing the name Leo Collins Dealership, and beneath it, the words, "Where dreams come true." It was a simple yet powerful message, one that captured the essence of what they wanted the dealership to represent. Henry stood there, his eyes filled with tears as he looked at the sign. He knew that Leo's memory would live on, not just in their hearts but in the hearts of everyone who would hear his story. As part of the grand reopening, Laura made sure that every new customer who walked through the doors would hear about Leo. She created a small display near the entrance, a picture of Leo, smiling brightly, with a plaque that told his story. It spoke of his dream to ride in a Ferrari, the illness he bravely faced, and the love of a grandfather who made that dream a reality. It was a reminder to everyone who entered that the dealership wasn't just about selling cars, it was about making a difference, about love and compassion. The story of Leo touched many people. Customers who came to the dealership were moved by the story, and it wasn't long before word spread throughout the community. The dealership became known not just for its luxury cars, but for the kindness and hope it represented. People came not just to buy cars, but to be part of something greater, to share in the spirit of love and compassion that Leo's story had inspired. Mark, the former manager, had also been profoundly affected by the events surrounding Leo. After being fired, he had taken Henry's words to heart. He had realized how wrong he had been, how his arrogance and prejudice had blinded him to what truly mattered. Determined to change, Mark began attending personal development courses. He learned about empathy, humility, and the importance of treating others with respect. Slowly, he began to transform, not just in his actions but in his heart. One day, Mark returned to the dealership. He walked through the doors, his eyes immediately drawn to the picture of Leo at the entrance. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, feeling the weight of his past actions. He knew that he had a long way to go, but he also knew that he was ready to make amends. He approached the front desk, asking to speak with Laura and Henry. Laura greeted Mark, her expression cautious but curious. Henry, too, was there, and when he saw Mark, he gave him a gentle nod. "Mrs. Laura, Mr. Collins," Mark began, his voice sincere, "I want to thank you both for giving me a second chance. I know I didn't deserve it, but I've worked hard to change. Leo's story, your kindness, it made me realize what kind of person I want to be." Laura looked at Mark, and for the first time, she saw not the arrogant manager she had once known, but a man who was genuinely trying to be better. Henry stepped forward, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "It takes a lot of courage to admit your mistakes and work to change," Henry said, his voice warm. "I'm proud of you, Mark. Leo would be, too." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes, and he nodded, overwhelmed by the acceptance he was being shown. "I want to help," he said. "If there's anything I can do for the dealership, for Leo's legacy, I'd be honored." Laura smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "We could always use more people who believe in what we're doing here, Mark," she said. "You're welcome to help us share Leo's story and continue making a difference." From that day on, Mark became a part of the dealership again, not as a manager, but as someone who was dedicated to sharing Leo's legacy. He spoke with customers, told them about Leo, and helped ensure that everyone who entered the dealership felt the warmth and compassion that had come to define Leo Collins' dealership. The changes at the dealership were profound. It was no longer just a place to buy luxury cars. It had become a place of inspiration, of hope. People came to hear Leo's story, to be reminded of the importance of love, kindness, and the impact that a single act of compassion could have. The dealership flourished, not just because of the cars they sold, but because of the spirit they embodied. For Henry, knowing that Leo's memory would continue to touch so many lives brought him a sense of peace. He often visited the dealership, sometimes just to sit by the display and see people reading about Leo, their faces softening as they learned about his grandson. It was a beautiful reminder that even though Leo was no longer with them, his spirit lived on, in every smile, in every act of kindness, in every dream that was fulfilled. "Leo taught us that the most important thing is love and compassion," Laura often said, her voice filled with conviction. And every day, Leo Collins' dealership continued to honor that lesson, ensuring that Leo's legacy, a legacy of love, hope, and the power of a dream, would never be forgotten. On the day of the grand opening of the dealership with its new name, there was a sense of excitement in the air. The sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over the newly refurbished building. The large sign above the entrance proudly displayed the new name, Leo Collins Dealership, where dreams come true. It was a day of celebration, but also a day of remembrance, a day to honor the life of a young boy whose dream had inspired an entire community. Henry arrived early, accompanied by his daughter, Alice. They stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the dealership with its new sign, a symbol of Leo's enduring legacy. Alice held her father's arm, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked up at the sign. "He would have loved this, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Henry nodded, his heart full as he thought of his grandson. "Yes, he would," he replied softly. Soon, friends, customers, and members of the community began to gather. They came not just to celebrate the reopening of a dealership, but to honor Leo, to remember his bright smile and the joy that he brought to everyone around him. Laura and Jack stood by the entrance, greeting everyone warmly. They were both moved by the turnout. So many people had come to show their support and to be part of this special day. As the ceremony began, Laura stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with emotion as she saw so many familiar faces. People who had been touched by Leo's story, people who had come to support Henry and Alice, and people who believed in the message that the dealership now stood for. Laura took a deep breath, her voice clear and steady as she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here today," Laura said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Today, we are not just opening a new dealership. We are honoring a boy with a heart full of dreams and passion. Leo Collins was a young boy who loved Ferraris, who dreamed of riding in one, and who faced challenges that no child should ever have to face. But through it all, he never lost his hope, his joy, or his love for life." Laura paused, her voice trembling slightly as she continued. "Leo taught us that the most important thing we can do is to love, to be kind, and to bring joy to those around us. That is what this dealership will stand for. It will be a place where dreams come true, a place where everyone is treated with the respect and compassion that Leo showed to the world." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of emotion washing over everyone present. Laura stepped back, nodding to Henry, who slowly made his way to the podium. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes misty as he took a deep breath. "Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jack. And thank you to everyone who is here today," Henry began, his voice thick with emotion. "Leo may have left us, but the joy he experienced in his final days will always be the most beautiful memory for me. That ride in the Ferrari, the laughter, the excitement, it was everything I could have hoped for and more." Henry paused, looking down for a moment before raising his eyes to meet the crowd. I hope that Leo's story will inspire all of you, just as it has inspired me. Life can be incredibly difficult at times, but even in the face of those difficulties, we have the power to bring joy, to bring hope, and to make dreams come true. That is what Leo taught me, and that is what I hope we can all carry with us. The crowd stood in respectful silence for a moment before erupting into another round of applause. Alice stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her father, her eyes filled with tears of pride and love. Together, they stood before the sign, as Laura and Jack joined them, and the cover was officially pulled away, revealing the new name in all its glory. Leo Collins Dealership, where dreams come true. The applause was warm and heartfelt, echoing across the lot as everyone looked up at the sign, a symbol of everything that had brought them to this moment. Mark stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. He felt a sense of pride swell within him, not just for the dealership, but for himself. He had come a long way from the person he used to be, and he knew that he had Henry to thank for giving him the chance to change. Mark made his way through the crowd, approaching Henry once the applause had died down. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice filled with sincerity. "Mr. Henry," Mark began, "I just wanted to thank you. Because of you, I've been able to change and become a better person. I'll never forget what you did for me." Henry turned to Mark, a gentle smile spreading across his face. He placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, his eyes filled with warmth. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, Mark," Henry said. "I'm glad you took it. Keep moving forward. Leo would be proud of you too." Mark nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew that this was just the beginning, a second chance that he would never take for granted. He had a role to play in keeping Leo's legacy alive, and he was determined to make a difference, just as Henry had done for Leo. As the ceremony concluded, the dealership opened its doors, welcoming everyone inside. The atmosphere was filled with positivity and hope, a feeling that was almost palpable. People walked through the showroom, admiring the cars, but also stopping to look at the display dedicated to Leo. There, beneath his smiling photograph, were the words that had come to define the dealership, where dreams come true. Customers came and went, many taking a moment to read about Leo's story, to learn about the young boy who had inspired so much love and kindness. For Henry, watching people take a moment to honor Leo brought him a deep sense of comfort. Leo's story was no longer just his own, it belonged to everyone who walked through those doors, everyone who believed in the power of love and compassion. In the weeks and months that followed, Leo Collins Dealership became more than just a car dealership. It became a symbol of what was possible when people came together to make a difference. Jack and Laura worked tirelessly to ensure that every customer who walked through their doors felt the same warmth and kindness that Henry and Leo had experienced. Mark, now a changed man, dedicated himself to his work, always remembering the lessons he had learned from Henry and Leo. The dealership hosted community events, fundraisers for children's hospitals, and even dream days, where children facing illnesses were given the chance to experience their dreams, whether it was riding in a Ferrari, meeting their favorite sports player, or simply spending a day surrounded by love and laughter. It was all done in Leo's memory, to honor the boy whose dream had inspired so many. Henry often visited the dealership, sometimes just to sit and watch as people came and went, as they read about Leo, and as they carried his story with them. He knew that Leo's legacy was alive and well, not just in the cars they sold, but in the hearts of everyone who heard his story. And for Henry, that was enough. It was a reminder that no matter how short a life might be, it could still leave an impact that would last forever. As the sun began to set on the day of the grand opening, the dealership lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the lot. Henry stood with Alice, Laura, Jack, and Mark, looking up at the sign one last time. Leo Collins Dealership, where dreams come true. It was more than a name. It was a promise to continue sharing love, compassion, and hope, just as Leo had taught them all.